It is finally here, the moment everybody's been waiting for. It's going to be a complete Relic tier list as of the 18th of March 2025. So this video is going to be coming out kind of towards the end of the month. I'm essentially just kind of pre-recording it, scheduling it for later. So there may be, oh my god, I cannot talk apparently. There may be new relics inside the game by the time this releases, but hopefully not, because there's already a lot of them. There's a lot to go over, so we're going to be going ahead and grading them all on this fancy tier maker tier list that I have here. I did make this a public tier list, and I did share it inside my Discord. So if you would like to create your own tier list or rank these, if you think it should be changed, what I'd recommend is come in, follow the link, create your tier list, rank them how you think is fair, and then go ahead and share a screenshot of it in the Discord. I'd love to hear everybody's feedback on it, and having kind of a community project like that is pretty cool. So we're going to have the collection, or not the collection, rather the index pulled up here so we can kind of go through all of them. And there's a lot of relics to get through, so let's go ahead and talk about this. Few caveats before we get into it. First of all, the relics are going to be ranked according to essentially how good they are in their respective rarity. So for example, it doesn't matter how good any sort of a rare relic is, a lot of times they're going to get outdone by, for example, a mythical relic. So I didn't want to just rate stuff lowly simply because of its rarity. So there's going to be some rare relics that rank higher than mythical, legendary, or epic relics just because of how useful they are essentially. Another thing to consider is that, as far as I know, very few to almost no players inside the game have mythical relics yet. Like, it is incredibly rare, so a lot of the mythical rankings that you'll see both from my tier list, obviously, but also from a lot of other people's tier lists are simply going to be hypotheticals. We're reading how good it is. We can't actually know for sure until we've started to play with it. And I've been getting absolutely shafted on the luck side of things for relics. I have one legendary relic so far, which is the Cat's Gaze. So I'm not doing too hot, but let's go ahead. Let's hop into this. First of all, we have Volcardiac Heart, which is a very cool name. Wearer is going to place a 10% magma shield on all allies for 2 turns at the start of the battle. Also place a 10% magma shield on the wearer for 2 turns whenever they lose 25% of their HP in a single hit. This has obviously resistance, HP, and defense scaling, so it's fantastic for any sort of a tank champion. And you might be wondering to yourself, well, when is Magma Shield? Well, we can come over to our champion skills, right? So if we go over here, if we take a look at something that applies a buff or a debuff, we then can get into this all buffs and debuffs menu. And if we scroll all the way down here, we see Magma Shield. I'll leave this up on the screen. You can feel free to read it. Essentially, simply put, Magma Shield is just a really messed up version of reflect damage that's going to reflect 100% of the damage dealt to that shield to the attacker, and it's also going to work as a regular shield. So all things considered, I do think that this is an incredibly strong relic, and the reason being is we've seen, for example, Under Priest Brogni pop up in a lot of areas because of his reflect damage ability under his shields. If you can just have what is essentially a shield set that gets placed through a relic that reflects damage, that is very, very strong, and you can obviously combine this with other shield sets as well. So with all that in mind, I am going to go ahead and put the heart into the A tier. I think this one is very, very good because obviously it has use in PvE, helping keep, your champions alive, but also PvP. It's especially useful somewhere like where you're going through a lot of waves, right? So like Doom Tower waves or something like that. For example, the Mortu Macabre waves, if you have a shield that's reflecting 100% of the damage you take, you could potentially survive Mortu Macabre's nuke and reflect a little bit of damage to him, though that would require some testing because I suppose he just ignores the shield, so he's not really doing any damage to it. So disregard that. Not going to be useful against Mortu Macabre. It is what it is. Next up, we have Hallowed Hilt. Whenever the wearer heals an ally with an active skill, has a 25% chance to place the Fervor buff on the ally for 1 turn. Again, if you don't know what Fervor does, use the method I showed you just to go ahead and look it up and find out. The Hallowed Hilt is in terms of its actual effect, but nobody really cares about its effect, and the Hallowed Hilt goes into the S tier in my opinion, and the reason for that is simply its scaling. It is one of like 2 relics in the entire game that have speed as a primary scaling, so this relic is an instant wear for any sort of Arbiter, Eostrid, Mikage's, Crixias, the new fusion that we have, anybody who needs speed. And then you also get HP on there, obviously, for some tankiness and resistance for, you know, again, that's perfect for somebody like a Crixia, right? So Hallowed Hilt is an absolutely fantastic relic for that reason. We have Aspect of Searoth, which when a wearer receives fatal damage, reduces it by 50% of their turn meter. So for example, if they have 100% turn meter, it's going to reduce the damage by 50% and fully reduces their turn meter. Cooldown 1 turn. Now this one has been getting a lot of, for example, hype for being used on somebody like a Rotos, which if you do have a Rotos, it's fantastic. You could potentially combo it with somebody like a Sun Wukong with a Freya passive or something like that, right? Since she's going to grant the instant turn anyways. Altogether, though, I think it is incredibly niche, and because of that, it's going into the B tier. I couldn't rank it really any lower than that because even though it is niche, it does have good scaling. So defense, resistance, and accuracy is something that you're going to want for a lot of support champions, really all of those stats. So it is definitely decent to say the least. We have Wand of Submission next. So this one has a 25% chance at base level. I'm going over base levels, people. It's going to take us long enough to get these artifacts or relics as is. We're not going to be pretending that we also have them leveled up fully, but obviously they get significantly better when it's leveled up, right? So Wearer has a 25% chance to reflect Stun, Sleep, Fear, True Fear, Freeze, Provoke, Petrification, and Sheep debuffs back at the producer. So for example, anytime Armand's opens with his A2, anytime he tries an A3 on a champion wearing this, there's straight up a 25% chance to just reflect all of that nastiness back to him. This one is basically the ultimate RNG stick for use inside the arena is where you're really going to use it, right? So it goes into the S tier pretty easy. It is a fantastic relic. We have the Gilded Dragonstone, which was my first epic relic. This one is wearer's defense increases by 1% each time they receive damage, stacks up to 10%. Now, this might be controversial, but I think this one is pretty shit, in all honesty. It's going into the C tier. A 10% defense increase after taking 10 hits is pretty useful. If you've taken those 10 hits, it's pretty obvious that you have the ability to survive whatever's hitting you. So really, the only time that you could argue it's useful is if you have a damage dealer that is defense-based. So like a Ragash or, you know, Khan or any sort of a defense-based damage dealer. But then in reality, you're going to want something that has like crit damage on it instead of, you know, defense scaling, right? So this one is obviously made more so for like a tank champion, but again, like defense just scales so poorly in PvP, you're focusing on HP anyways, so I think C tier is kind of where this one goes. In all honesty, I almost view it as like a food relic, as controversial as that might be to say, because it goes on, like I have a couple of them that are just kind of sitting on my champions because I want, you know, stats and I don't have any other relics that I can put on them at the moment, but it's certainly not very good in my opinion. We have Demonic Effigy. Demonic Effigy is wearer's turn meter increases by 10% whenever one of their allies die. Now this one I actually think is pretty damn good, so it's kind of the opposite of the Gilded Dragonstone. This one I think is very, very useful, and the reason for that, if you think about any sort of Pythion, Duchess, Galathier, Scylla the Drakes, any sort of a revive champion, you generally build them out with the Timely Intervention Mastery. The Timely Intervention basically says, hey, anytime my champion's HP drops below a certain threshold, I'm going to get a certain amount of turn meter. So this basically says, like, let's say you're in arena, right? And let's say you have a Duchess inside Stone Skin and the rest of your team just gets absolutely slammed. They all die. This Demonic Effigy alone is going to give your Duchess 40% extra turn meter, as well as giving her HP, resistance, and speed, right? 40% extra turn meter at a base level when your team dies is just absolutely insane when you combine that with, again, like a Timely Intervention type of mastery, right? So it's a very, very good relic in my opinion, and I don't think it's getting the love it deserves. It's definitely going into the B tier though. I can't quite justify putting it into the A tier because as with a lot of these relics, I think there's just better alternatives available for, you know, some champions, but when you can use it incredibly well in my opinion. We have the Golden Elixir, Wearer is instantly healed by 10% when their HP drops below 50%. This one might have some niche uses. It could be used obviously on a support champion, but I do think any sort of a support champion would be better built with even some of the other relics that we've talked about already, because it's scaling as attack and accuracy, so you'd really want to put it onto like a bomb champion or something like that, but it just doesn't really make sense in terms of the effect with those type of champions, and its glyph spots are okay, right? So I don't think it's too impressive. Because of that, I am going to go ahead and put it into the C tier. I'm not a big fan of this relic whatsoever. We have the Unholy Grail, where deals 2% more damage if under any debuffs. This one has attack, HP, and crit damage scaling. It's kind of unanimously decided with inside the community that this one kind of sucks cheeks. I think there's some situational use to it. So, for example, inside Hydra or inside damage testing, a lot of times what you'll see is a Gerptuk Mossbeard run with a Trunda, because Gerptuk is going to place poisons on your own allies and then increase the damage that they receive for each of those poisons. So this Unholy Grail could very much be used on the DPS hero or a secondary DPS hero on a Gerptuk team. That being said, though, even in that situational use case, I think there still are better damage dealing options that we'll get to later. So because of that, the Unholy Grail is going to get ranked as a C tier. Next up, we have the Mask of Rage, where receives 5% less damage from enemies under a provoke. This, in my opinion, is about as useless as it gets. When you're provoking enemies, they're doing an A1. There's very few champions inside the game that have incredibly hard-hitting A1s, especially in PvE. So a lot of times your champion can just simply tank that, survive that, right? And 5% damage reduction, obviously that goes up, but, you know, not by a whole lot. It's not really anything to write home about, and again, in a lot of situations, there's just better options. So because of that, the mask does actually earn our first F tier. It's not going to be solo there, though. Do not worry. Journal of Necrotos. HP, defense, and resistance scaling. This one is insane when it comes to a rare relic. In terms of, you know, actually wanting a relic, this one is probably my most wanted because I have a lot of turn meter boosters and I just don't have enough of these to go around right now. Wearer's heals and turn meter increase effects applied to allies are boosted by 15%. And if you can level this one up, it goes up a lot more as well. This is absolutely insane. If you think about any sort of an Eostrad Dream Song, Arbiter, Senna, if you were lucky enough to pull her, which I was, Deacon Armstrong, any sort of a champion that does increase turn meter, this simply makes it 15% stronger at a base level, 30% stronger once you get it upgraded. This is obscenely good, especially for a rare relic. So because of that, it does actually go into the S tier without question. The fact that I want this relic, even though it's a rare, and the fact that I use this relic and that I don't have enough of them to be used on my account says a lot, right? I'm not sitting here wishing that I had more insert trash relic here. I want more Journals of Necrotos. It is so incredibly good. Lastly, we have the Rod of Trash. This one is wearer receives 2% less damage if under any debuffs. Kind of enough said when we talked about the Mask of Rage, right? The 2% is just not enough to make any sort of a difference. It's just not that good of a relic, and because of that, it is going to go into the C tier. I do think it's a little bit more useful than the Mask of Rage, so it's not going to be an F tier, but it's definitely pretty damn close. Next up, we have Stormcaller. Stormcaller, wearer has a 20% chance of placing a Stormcall buff on themselves whenever they land a critical hit. Stormcall buff basically says, hey, I'm increasing your damage by 5%. I can stack up to 5 times, and then I'm ripped off for an extra effect. So it's very similar to the Stormcaller buff that we see on Thor. This one is very good, though, because it has crit damage, attack, and speed scaling, so it's incredibly good for a damage dealer. I don't think the effect is very good for DPS heroes, though, right? So it's just going to be a temporary damage increase. There's other options that can give you a permanent damage increase, right, that just simply are better. It is going into the A tier, though, because it has insane stats with it, and it does have very good glyph spots as well. We have the Chrono Cube. Wearer has a 50% chance to take 2 turns in a row. If this effect activates, wearer skips the next turn. Occurs only once per battle. this is... So if you're not familiar or if you haven't played Raid too long, basically the way to win in PvP game modes is just as much RNG as you can possibly throw in it. Just fuck it, everything RNG, right? There's not much of a skill element to this game in a lot of cases. It's spending money and RNG. And we've seen that kind of throughout the history of the game with reaction accessories. Obviously now we have Stone Skin where it's always just a 50-50. We have like affinity matchups. We have like, you know, all this random BS that goes on champions that can really just, you know, even if you're 10 million player power stronger, you can still lose to somebody you shouldn't have because of the RNG, right? So that's the name of the game. And the Chrono Cube is just an RNG introducer into your battles. So because of that, I do think it's strong. I think it goes into the A tier. I don't think it's very useful in PvE because you're skipping turns. It can throw out speed tunes and all that sort of stuff. But for PvP, it is definitely very, very strong. We have the Gore Crescent, otherwise known as the Trash Scythe. Wearer's next attack after killing an enemy does 20% more damage. 20% more damage, people. How bad is that? We have attack, crit damage, and speed scaling, so the stat scaling is good. However, the effect is just absolutely trash. If you notice me looking to the side, it's because I actually have notes on my phone where I went through all these last night and I ranked them so I wouldn't have to remember it. And I, you know, looked through it very carefully and made sure that I was ranking these in an appropriate fashion. So Gore Crescent is going to get a C. It's not good, right? Because you think about it, for PvP, you're going to generally have AoE nukers. So if we think about some of the strongest AoE nukers that are in the meta right now, you have obviously Harima, who's a lot of AoE. You have Nice, who does a lot of AoE. You have Thor, AoE. Sun Wukong, Taurus, Narcisse, Khan. He's not very strong, but he's been added. All of these champions are predominantly AoE damage dealers. Gore Crescent has no use for them because when they do their AoE, they're most likely going to kill everybody anyways, and if they don't, the follow-up is probably going to be strong enough even without this bonus to just finish them off. So between Gore Crescent and some of the other, like, you know, just straight up legendary artifacts on here, legendary relics rather, like I'd rather have a Wand of Submission even on a damage dealing champion because 20% is not a huge damage boost, all things considered. Especially when you're factoring in like ignore defense and those sorts of things. There are very few champions inside the game currently. You know what? There's almost no champions inside the game currently that can withstand a nuke from a well-built nuker. If we take a Sun Wukong's A2, right, in a good scenario, so where obviously reaction doesn't proc, you don't have stone skin on them, all the BS, right? No UDK, all that. Nobody survives that. Just case closed. Nobody survives his A2, the only exception being champions that have some sort of an inbuilt passive, which is going to make this irrelevant anyways. So, like, for example, a Rotos, Galathier, Siegfried, right? Those sorts of champions are really going to be the only ones that can survive just a well-placed nuke, right? A Thor A2 would be another perfect example with how much absolute shredding damage he does. Nobody survives that. So, it's like, you don't need this damage boost, and there's other relics that will give you better stat scaling. So it's like, what is the use case, right? Obviously, you could say, well, for PvE, it's pretty good, and those sorts of things. And granted, yes, it's a legendary relic that you can use in PvE. Great, amazing. Not good enough to rank it very high, in my opinion. Hand of Uncreation reduces the chance of applying debuffs, stealing or removing buffs, stealing turn meter, or increasing a skill's cooldown against the wearer by 10% with scaling of accuracy, resistance, and speed. Can you imagine how good this would be on a Mithrala Lifebane or a Crixia or a Fabian? It's going to be insane, right? Once people start getting this more, I think Hand of Creation is a very, very solid relic. So because of that, I am going to go ahead and put it into the B tier. I don't think it's quite good enough to be ranked inside the A tier, but it is a very strong relic in my opinion. We have Scroll of the Unseen. Wearer's damage increases by 1% each time any other champion takes a turn when the wearer is under a veil or perfect veil buff, stacks up to 30%. Damage bonus resets after the wearer takes a turn. This relic, excuse me, spoiler alert, goes into the C tier. That last point of text takes this relic from a C tier, or sorry, rather an S tier to a C tier. If it didn't say damage bonus resets after the wearer takes a turn, this would be infinitesimally better. I think that's a word. This would be so much better because it has good scaling. It has attack, crit damage, and speed. It's obviously made for a damage dealing champion, right? So we think about it though, there's not many damage dealers that are coming in and just applying a veil to themselves automatically. And then on top of that, even if you have a support champion that applies a veil to your team, having that damage boost reset, right? Like, because it takes it's so hard to say how frustrating it is how much they drop the ball with this relic, because at base level, let's say your Duchess comes in and applies an AoE veil, and then you have a Yumiko go and lock everybody out, right? That's a 1% damage boost for your damage dealer. You're not going to get 30 turns in between, right? And most players aren't going to have this ranked up for quite some time. So you're not getting 30 turns in between when the veil is placed versus when it's not. Even in PvE, you're not getting 30 turns, right? And when it says any other champion, I don't think this is going to count inside like Spider or those sorts of things. So it's just, if it didn't reset, this would be an incredibly strong relic. Orb of Transfixion. Wearer has a 10% chance to steal one random buff when attacking a target. This effect cannot be resisted, occurs once per skill. I actually kind of like this relic. And because of that, it's going into the B tier. It doesn't have incredibly good scaling for a lot of champions, so HP, accuracy, and speed. It's mainly just for like a support, right? The fact that it cannot be resisted is very strong. I actually run this relic on my Sun Wukong inside the arena. That way, if I'm AoEing into a UDK, if I'm A1ing into a UDK, there's a strong chance that I can steal the stone skin from that UDK, and I don't have to worry about the accuracy requirements to do so. It's an incredibly strong relic situationally. Of course, you could use it on like a Mithrala, Pythion, Duchess, Galathyr, any sort of a champion that's just, you know, a support champion as well, since that's who it's really made for, but essentially I didn't have anything better to put on my Sun Wukong. We have the Irithi Coronet. Irithi Coronet, wearer's damage increases by 1% each time they receive a debuff, stacks up to 30%. Now, Scroll of the Unseen, this is how you be a good relic. Get rid of that text that says resets when champion takes a turn. It's such a crock of shit, let's be honest, okay? This is how you make a relic. This is incredibly good, right? Because even at a base level, stacks up to 30%. When you promote it, you're just getting those stacks quicker. That's it. It has attack and accuracy, which is exactly what you're going to want on a damage dealer that's placing debuffs, right? So if you think about your Thor, if you think about a Nishak, those sorts of champions, this, over the duration of a longer fight, is simply going to mean a 30% damage increase regardless of what tier you have it at, what level it's at, and it's just simply amazing. So because of that, the Irithi Coronet goes into the S tier without question. It is such a good relic. We have the Malefic Talon. Wearer has a 20% chance to deal 10% more damage when attacking, with a crit damage scaling as well as attack as a rare relic. This is going into the A tier. This is one of the better rare relics. It is incredibly good. This is simply just saying, hey, here's some RNG that's going to allow you to introduce more damage into your teams. There's not really a downside to it, right? It's giving you good stats. It's giving you more damage. It is absolutely incredible. Diadem of Undeath. Wearer's defense increases by 1% for each ally under an ally protection placed by them. At a base level, let's think about this, right? Best case scenario. Best case scenario, right? You're in Hydra. You have 5 other champions on the team. You place an ally protection. You get a 5% defense increase with this relic. A 5% defense increase. How absolutely terrible is that? This is going into the F tier without a question. Absolute trash. Tempest Sanguinius. Wearer's turn meter reduction effects are boosted by 15%. This is very similar to, obviously, the Journal of Necrodos that we've seen earlier. I think this is actually a very good relic. I have to scroll down on my alternative screen here. What's funny too is on my phone it auto corrected, so it doesn't say Tempest. It says tempura, like, you know, going and getting a tempura shrimp or whatever, which I find kind of funny. But the tempura is going to be ranked inside the B tier because I do think that this is situationally very useful. Again, for champions like Eustrids, Deacons, Lissandras, any sort of champions that are just draining turn meter, this is going to be very, very good. Molten Deathbell, wearer's turn meter increases by 10% when applying CCs, basically. Occurs once per turn. I think this is actually a very good relic as well, and I do actually have one, and I do actually use it on my Armands because, lo and behold, he's applying a shit ton of stuns, and he's applying a shit ton of sheeps, right? So, because of that, Molten Deathbell is actually going to rank a lot higher than I think most people would expect it to be, and that's going to be a B tier relic. I think it is incredibly useful. Moving on, we have Cat's Gaze, which is one of the best damage-dealing relics in the entire game, where it ignores 10% of the target's defense when attacking enemies with higher max HP, with crit damage, and attack scaling. This one, we don't really need to discuss further. Ignore defense is how you do damage. This one's an easy S tier. We have Hatter's Reserve, which I think is going to be a controversial placement on the tier list. I imagine a few people are going to get kind of grumpy with this. HP attack and crit damage scaling. Let's read this. Wearer receives 5% less damage from enemies whose attack is lower than the wearer's. Right? Also inflicts 5% more damage to enemies whose max HP is lower than the wearer's. What does this mean? Well, obviously, you want to run this on a damage-dealing champion, right? So let's take a Sun Wukong, for example. Wearer receives 5% less damage from enemies whose attack is lower than the wearer's. So Sun Wukong is now going to receive less damage from hits from people like Mithrala, right? Hits from people like Duchess. Hits from people like UDK, right? I don't know if you've ever used a attack-based damage dealer inside any piece of content, but the hits that you're worried about surviving are not coming from the support champions on the enemy team unless your damage dealer is literally at like 1 HP, right? You're worried about the hits coming in from the enemy team's damage dealer. The only time this might be useful to counter a damage dealer is if you're going against like a Harima or a Taurus or those sorts of things, right? So it's incredibly situational. And then the second part of it is just as useless because it says also inflicts more damage to enemies whose max HP is lower than the wearer's. Whose max HP is going to be lower than your damage dealer? Well, that's right. Potentially the other team's damage dealers if they're attack-based damage dealers, right? Because generally defensive-based damage dealers are quite tanky inherently. And then obviously HP-based damage dealers, good luck, right? So this one is essentially a solution searching for a problem. It's going to help you survive hits from champions that won't kill you anyways, and it's going to help you hit champions harder that you're going to kill anyways. So it's like, where's the use case? There isn't one. It's terrible. It goes into the F tier. It's the first epic relic. It might be the only epic relic that we have inside the F tier. I'm not a big fan of this one whatsoever. Murderfang. Wearer has a 25% chance to deal bonus damage when using the default skills. Bonus damage is either 3% single target hits or 1% on AoE hits of target's max HP. I think this is fantastic when you're using, especially somebody that can AoE or even a single target. Having a relic that's going to allow you to essentially proc War Master or Giant Slayer in extra time is absolutely insane, right? So with that in mind, Murderfang, I'm just trying to look at my alternative screen here so I can actually see where I placed it. So Murderfang, I actually placed inside the A tier. I think this is a very good relic. It's very, very solid. Chrysalid of Rebirth. Wearer has a 30% chance, again at base level, with a primary scaling of speed, by the way, to get an extra turn when reviving allies or themselves. This is very strong, right? You think about your Galathirs, your Duchess, your Ancoras, any sort of a champion that's reviving allies or themselves, which means this could also go on a Sun Wukong and instantly grant him a turn, which is just absolutely insane, right? This is such a good relic in my opinion, and I think it deserves to go into the S tier without a question. If you combine this with the new Rebirth set that we have coming in from Live Arena, it could be just absolutely insane. We have Essence Quencher. Absolutely fantastic name. Wearer's damage is increased by 20% of the target's current turn meter. Damage cannot be increased by more than 10% or 5% against bosses. There's probably a little bit of a pause there on the screen. I got a phone call apparently, but we're back. So the damage cannot be increased by more than 10%, 5% against bosses. I think this is another very solid relic. The reason for that being, it's just simply more damage that's going to work inside PvE and PvP, which is something that we always need, right? So let's go ahead, let's take a look at it here. This one is going into the B tier. I think that's a very fair ranking for it. We have the Temporal Stagnator. Wearer has a 20% chance to remove, steal, or convert buffs or increase a skill's cooldown when landing a weak hit. Essentially what this means is, let's say you're taking your Fabian in, your new fusion that you just got, or your Armands, and normally they'd get a weak hit. Well, they're going to have a 20% chance at a base level to just do their effect anyways with accuracy, speed, and resistance scaling. This is like pretty much as good as it gets, right, for support champions. I'm going to put it into the A tier. I do think there's better options out there, obviously, but, you know, it's still an incredibly strong relic. Inferno Sphere. Wearer's resistance increases by 2% for every 5% of HP loss, stacks up to 20%. We're kind of in a meta right now where we have mythicals that are ignoring resistance. We have increased accuracy buffs absolutely everywhere. We have relics that are adding extra accuracy. The resistance meta is essentially all but dead. In even Gold 5, you know, Classic Arena, or certainly Gold 2 where I am currently in Tag Team Arena, it is very hard to resist, even with my Mithrala, who has like 700 resistance on her, which is not, or sorry, she has like 900 resistance on her, which is not that much in today's meta. Because of that, I do have to rank this relic quite low, unfortunately, so it is going into the C tier. Just better options out there. Valkanon's Grasp. Wearer reflects 5% of damage absorbed by block damage or unkillable buffs back to the attacker. I think this is an incredibly good relic. The reason being, so it's going to go into the B tier. The reason being, this is just strictly a damage increase. For example, a clan boss team, right? If you're running a Demitha in your clan boss team, you throw this on your Demitha, she's now reflecting 5% of the damage that the boss is doing to your block damage, which is just simply a way to say, hey, we're doing more damage. That's it, right? And not only that, it has no speed scaling on it, so it's not going to mess up a speed tune or anything like that, which is absolutely incredible. Can be used in the arena. You're reflecting, you know, for example, Helicath with his block damage, right? Iron Twins Fortress, reflecting damage with block damage. This is an incredibly good relic, in my opinion. Flesh Render. Wearer increases the damage of each hit on their next attack by 3% of any surplus heal when self-healing. Damage cannot be increased by more than 20,000 and will reset after each attack. This is just a very relic overall. It seems to be suited towards kind of somebody that might be soloing, somebody that's, you know, just healing, support champions. It is a damage increasing relic, which is why it's not in F tier, but I just don't think it's very useful, so it is going to go into the C tier. Black Shroud Fan. Wearer receives 2% less damage from ally protection effects or buffs placed on them. Guess where this one's going, guys? What is going on here? I am very confused. What the... Gotta love Windows 11. Black Shroud Fan going into the F tier. If you have a ally that's placing ally protection, you're simply just going to have better options for it, right? Case closed. Infernal Polytope. Fully resets the cooldowns of the wearer's skills whenever their HP drops below 15%. This is incredibly situational. I am actually going to go ahead and rank this into the A tier. And the reason for that being, if you pair it with somebody like a Freya's passive, she can very much, you know, obviously save somebody when their HP goes low. And then she can also just go ahead and have their skills reset if they're wearing this. So, for example, a Sun Wukong, a Georgid, something like that, right? If you would nuke them down, Freya says, hey, I'm saving them. Then their skills are also fully reset, which is absolutely insane. We have the Death Dealer. Wearer's attacks will always be critical hits, but the wearer receives 200% more damage. This one is insane, in my opinion. This is probably my most wanted mythical artifact. It's going into the S tier without a singular question. Being able to build my Taurus with like no crit rate and just fully crit damage HP is going to be so good. Building a Sun Wukong with like no crit rate and just attack and crit damage is so good. Harp of Casbiel. Wearer's turn meter fills by 5% each time they use a skill that doesn't deal damage. This is going to be kind of just a passive turn meter fill if you're placing any sort of like buffs or anything like that, which is kind of cool. It's going to go into the B tier. It's a decent artifact or relic. I keep calling them artifacts. Whatever. You know what I mean. It's a decent relic. It adds some stats. You know, it's okay. Axe Serpentis. Wearer's single target attacks deal 5% more damage for each exposed neck present in the battle. Here's the problem with this. To get a lot of exposed necks, generally, you're going to be relying on either a shit ton of ally attacks, or more realistically, you're going to be relying on AoE damage. So it doesn't really make sense that you're going to want to do single target attacks dealing more damage, right? Granted, this can be a 20% increase, and you could probably use it on Trunda's A2, but I don't think it's incredibly useful, and because of that, it is going to go into the C tier. It's very situational at best, very poor at worst. Preserved Aberration. Wearer will ignore 2% of a target's defense for each poison debuff on the target placed by the wearer. I do think that this one has significantly more use case than the last relic we talked about, and is going into the B tier because of that. So this one could be useful, obviously, on somebody that's placing poisons, like, for example, a Nishak when he places the poisons after the bombs go off, right? Incredibly useful. Or somebody who's soloing content. So if you have, like, a, for example, a Venomage, or somebody like that who's just going in and placing poisons in PvE, going to be absolutely fantastic there as well. Moon Death Orchid. Wearer deals pure damage equal to 20% of their attack to enemies that resist debuffs from the wearer. This damage cannot be critical. This one is very situational at best. It is going into the C tier. If you're looking for damage dealing relics, there's just simply better options out there, in my opinion. I don't think it's incredibly good or anything like that, so you're probably better off investing in other areas of your account, in my opinion. We have the Royal Digit. Wearer has a 20% chance to decrease incoming damage by 10%. This one also going into the C tier. Really, no matter what sort of a champion you're using this on, I think there are better options, right? So, for example, if they're in Stone Skin, doesn't really matter if the damage is being decreased or not, right? Because it's very much oriented towards what seems to be an attacking champion, because it has attack as well as crit damage scaling on here. So it's not necessarily like they're like, hey, you know, put this on your supports. That's not what it's scaling off of, right? So triangular stones, I believe, are mainly for damage too. So it could be useful on maybe like a Harima or something like that if you have literally nothing else to use, but that's probably about it. Lastly, the last relic for our overall ranking is going to be the Draught of Ire. Wearer deals 5% more damage using their default skill when all other skills are on cooldown. This one's going into the B tier. I think it's just straight up a pretty decent relic. It's just saying, hey, you're simply doing more damage if these conditions are met, case closed, right? 5% more damage on your A1s. It's like, okay, that is pretty cool. So it is very useful for that. And then obviously if you're using somebody like, say, a Toshiro inside Chimera, anytime he teams up with Mikage while his A2 and A3 are on cooldown, he's just simply doing 5% more damage at a base level. Plus, you're getting the accuracy and attack scaling, both of which are pretty useful, I would say. So this is the final ranking here. So obviously kind of a middle-heavy chart, right? We don't have too much in the F tier. We don't have too much in the S and the A, although the S and the A tiers are actually pretty equal, which is cool to see. So again, Discord, the link is in there. Go ahead, check it out, make your own tier list, share the tier list inside the Discord. I'd absolutely love to see what you guys are able to come up with. That being said, thank you all so much for watching the video. I'll see you next time.